Bedtime Reading. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Chapter 1. A Terrible Scene. One sunny Sunday morning in London, two well-dressed men were about to cross a street. They were Mr. Gabriel John Utterson, a lawyer, and his young cousin, Richard Enfield. Suddenly, a carriage with horses came up beside them, and the cabman leaned down from his seat, waving his whip.
"Good morning, gentlemen,"
the cabman called with a hopeful smile.
"Are you going to church on this fine Sunday? I'll take you there in 2 moments or less."
Mr. Utterson never spoke unless it was important. He frowned at the cabman and motioned with his hand for him to go away. But Richard gave the man a friendly smile and shook his head.
"No, my good man, we are out for a walk, which we take every Sunday. That's the way to see interesting things in London."
They crossed a few streets and soon found themselves in a dirty-looking neighborhood. Slowly, they walked down a small street full of shops. Mr. Utterson stopped to look at some interesting objects sitting in a store window. Suddenly, Richard touched his arm and spoke in a serious-sounding voice.
"Do you see that door across the street, cousin? That door reminds me of something very strange that happened to me."
Mr. Utterson looked at the old door with the fading paint. It belonged to a 2-story building that was one of several built around a courtyard. Because there were no windows at the front of the building, it looked strange and a little frightening. Mr. Utterson was usually not interested in strange stories, but now he became curious.
"Really? What does the door remind you of?"
Richard took him away from the store and spoke very softly.
"I was coming home alone from a party on a dark winter night. There were some lights in the street, but no people. Everyone was asleep, and I heard only my own footsteps. Not far from here, as I neared a corner, I suddenly saw 2 people. One coming up one street was a little girl, running as hard as she could, and coming up an alley on the side was a short, dark shadow of a man, walking quickly. I saw they were going to run into each other at the corner, but there was nothing I could do. It happened very fast. They hit one another, and the child was knocked off her feet. I heard her cry out in pain. By that time, I was running toward them to help in any way that I could."
Richard did not notice his cousin looking almost frightened as he listened to the story. If he had noticed, he would have stopped talking and been amazed, for Gabriel John Utterson rarely showed his emotions, even to his many friends. Richard spoke faster now, his eyes flashing with anger.
"The man had the wind knocked out of him for a moment. But instead of picking the child up, he crushed her with his feet. You may find it hard to believe, cousin, but I swear it is true. He stepped right on her and over her and continued to walk away. The child's screams were terrible. I ran after the man and grabbed him by his coat. The face he showed me was hideous and ugly. For a terrible moment, I wondered if this was a man or an animal."
Chapter 2. Blackmail.
"Did this man try to fight with you?"
asked Mr. Utterson.
"No,"
answered Richard.
"He did not seem to care at all. He did not resist me as I took him back to the child. By this time, a group of people had gathered around her, because they had heard her screams. They were the child's family, who lived 2 houses down from the corner. Luckily, a doctor soon joined the group. The little girl had been sent to get him because her mother was sick. He told us that she was only hurt a little, but she was, of course, badly frightened. All this time, I kept a tight hold on the man. He seemed so ugly and frightening to me that I hated to touch him. I could see that others hated him too, for his appearance as well as for what he had done. Even the doctor, who is accustomed to terrible sights, would not go near him. Why? Was he deformed?
asked Mr. Utterson.
Or scarred on his face?
Richard shook his head.
No, but there was a feeling of deformity about him. He looked like everyone else, and yet he did not. There was something strange and horrible about his appearance. He seemed like an evil animal on the inside. I cannot speak more clearly than that. Perhaps his nature was evil, so that he made others hate and fear him. I do not know. But what about the door? You said your adventure involved that door across the street,
said the lawyer, who was good at getting people to tell their stories quickly.
Yes, I'm coming to that,
said Richard.
We were all so angry that we promised to destroy his name in London society. We told him we would tell everyone what he had done. Then the man became rather frightened, although he tried to hide it. At last, he offered money to the child's family. At first it was only a few pounds, but finally we made him give the family 100 pounds. In return, we would say nothing. Of course, he was not carrying so much money on him. So he took the child's father, the doctor, and me to the door we are looking at now. He took out a key, opened the door, and went in. When he came out, he had 10 pounds in gold and the other 90 pounds in a cheque. But here, cousin, is the mystery, for the cheque was signed by a very well-known man. I will not tell you his name, because he is a very important man in his profession. He is also respected for his goodness and good deeds. Of course, we said we thought that the cheque must be a fake one, but this man said he could stay with us until the bank opened in the morning and then take us with him so he could cash the cheque in our presence.
Mr. Utterson's face was sad as he turned away from his cousin and said,
The cheque was good, I am sure. Yes,
said Richard eagerly.
I was coming to that. Well, by this time it was early morning. I took everyone back to my rooms, gave them breakfast, and then we went together to the bank. The bank gave the strange man the money without arguing. Then he calmly gave the money to the child's father, as if he gave away 100 pounds every day. But since it was not his money, I am sure he did not care. So I call that house across the street Blackmail House. That door must be an underground entrance to the home of this important good gentleman that I cannot name. This evil person must have some control over the gentleman. In short, he must be blackmailing him.
After this interesting end to the talk, Richard stopped talking. The two men continued walking along the street, but Mr. Utterson wanted to know more.
Did you try to find out why the gentleman was being blackmailed?
He asked. His voice was as calm as always, but Richard could see he was interested.
No,
said Richard.
I didn't want to know any more about it. One day, I saw the address of that important gentleman in the newspaper. It is in this neighborhood, right in this area. If that old door leads into his house somehow. I don't want to know for sure. The houses in that courtyard are so close together, it is hard to separate one house from another. If the gentleman has a guilty secret, which he pays the ugly man to keep hidden, then I am certainly not the person to try and find it out."
Richard nodded his head, happy with himself. Mr. Utterson was not done yet.
"You are sure the blackmailer used a key?"
he asked. His voice sounded like a lawyer's voice, as if he were in the courtroom.
"Cousin, I have told you so,"
answered Richard, surprised that Utterson doubted him.
"In fact, I walked by here last week and saw him use the key again to open that door. Oh, he has a key, make no mistake about that."
Mr. Utterson said quietly,
"Richard, aren't you surprised that I do not press you to tell me the name on the check?" "Yes, I am,"
said the younger man.
"I would be terribly curious if I were you. I suppose that as one grows older, one doesn't want any more surprises. Is that it?"
Mr. Utterson shook his head.
"No, I do not ask the name because I already know it."
Richard stood still.
"You know it?"
Mr. Utterson had continued walking, and now he looked back, motioning Richard to follow.
"Yes, I'm afraid I do. I agree with your decision not to examine the matter more closely. You are right not to interfere in the lives of others. But also, perhaps you should not pass on gossip, as you have done with me today."
Richard looked embarrassed.
"You are right, of course. I talk too much. Well, I will promise you I shall never talk about this subject again. Do you approve of that?"
The lawyer smiled at his young cousin with affection.
"Yes, except for one thing. First, will you answer one question about the incident?" "Of course, cousin."
Richard thought his cousin looked pale. With a great effort, Mr. Utterson kept his voice calm and quiet as he asked,
"Do you know the name of the man who entered that door with a key, the one who hurt the child?" "Yes, of course,"
said Richard.
"He told us his name was Mr. Hyde."
Chapter 3. A Strange Will. Usually, Mr. Utterson was in a good mood after his Sunday walks with his cousin. He liked his cousin's happy personality and his interesting opinions, but tonight Utterson was quiet and serious. Usually he ate all his dinner, but tonight he could not touch a bite. Later, his cook wondered if she had not cooked the beef well enough. After dinner, the lawyer took a candle and went to his library. There he opened a locked box and took out an envelope. The envelope read, "Dr. Jekyll's Will." Dr. Jekyll had written the will himself. When Jekyll first showed him the will, Utterson had been extremely surprised by the strange things that were written there. He was still very upset. Utterson was Jekyll's good friend, so he had agreed to keep the will for him. He would show it to the courts if it were ever necessary. Utterson put on his glasses. He did not want to read the strange will again, but he wanted to try to understand what was happening. The first part of the will was very normal. Utterson did not understand Jekyll's connection with Mr. Hyde, but he could not tell his client who he should give his money to. This first part said that if Jekyll died, all his possessions and money should be given to his dear friend Edward Hyde. It was the second part of the will that frightened Utterson. This part said that in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance of more than 3 months, Edward Hyde should immediately take everything Jekyll owned. Hyde would have to pay the servants some money, but then he would have no responsibilities. He could do whatever he wanted with Jekyll's things. Mr. Utterson did not understand this strange situation. Tonight, as he read these pages, he became even more worried. He was worried because he had just learned that Edward Hyde was an evil man, a criminal. Utterson sighed and put the will away, wishing he could do something about the terrible situation.
Why did Jekyll write about his own disappearance?
Thought the lawyer to himself. He remembered that his cousin Richard thought that Dr. Jekyll was being blackmailed, and he wondered if it was true.
Is something or someone going to make Henry Jekyll disappear?
He asked himself. Because Jekyll was a good friend, Utterson was quite upset by the story Richard had told him that morning.
Perhaps Lanyon can help me to understand Henry's actions.
In college, Utterson, Jekyll, and a man named Hasty Lanyon had all been close friends. The 3 men had done everything together. Lanyon was now a successful doctor. Utterson got his coat and quickly walked to Lanyon's large house in Cavendish Square. Dr. Lanyon was still at the dinner table, relaxing and drinking wine. He was happy to see Utterson and made Utterson feel better because he was so loud and cheerful. Utterson was a very quiet man, and he did not often like loud people. But Lanyon was the one person Utterson liked and trusted more than any other. A servant brought Utterson a glass of wine, and then the 2 men sat down in comfortable chairs. Utterson did not want to waste any time.
Lanyon, I think that you and I are Henry Jekyll's 2 oldest friends,
he said.
I wish we were all younger,
said Lanyon with a laugh.
But anyway, I haven't seen Henry in a long time. Really?
Said Utterson, surprised.
I thought you would spend a lot of time together, since you are both men of science.
Lanyon looked upset.
We were close friends,
he said quietly.
But for many years now I have watched Jekyll become more and more strange. Too strange for me. I do not like his ideas. His whole personality has become very unpleasant to me.
Utterson drank some of the fine old wine, but he still felt worried.
What do you mean, Jekyll is strange?
He asked. Lanyon suddenly became angry.
He is not a scientist any more. He thinks about such stupid things,
he said loudly.
I cannot be his friend any more.
Utterson felt relieved, and he thought to himself,
I understand. Lanyon and Jekyll do not agree about some scientific subject. The argument isn't personal.
He wanted to make sure his guess was right, however, so Utterson waited until Lanyon had drunk some more wine. Then he asked the question he had wanted to ask.
Lanyon, did you ever meet a man named Edward Hyde? He is a good friend of Jekyll's,
he said. Lanyon thought for a moment.
No, I've never heard of him.
Utterson felt better. Lanyon had never heard of Hyde, so perhaps he was not so important after all. And Lanyon had heard no bad news about Jekyll. The 2 friends talked about other things for a while, and then Utterson left. He did not know that this was the last time he would see his old friend Lanyon healthy and smiling. His death was near. Chapter 4. Mr. Hyde and Mr. Seek. Even though his visit with Lanyon made him feel better, Utterson did not sleep well. he had the same bad dreams over and over. In his dreams, he saw a child running down a dark, dirty street. A man was walking fast, and the two hit each other. Then the child was on the ground, with the man stepping on her while she screamed. Then Utterson had another dream. He saw Henry Jekyll asleep in his large, comfortable bedroom. Suddenly, the curtains around the bed opened, and a long arm, covered with hair, reached in. The hand had long, dirty, broken fingernails, like an ape. Then Jekyll was sitting at his desk, being forced to write a check for £90 by a man standing over him. The man wore black clothing, and Utterson could not see his face, but he knew it was Edward Hyde. The next morning, Utterson decided he had to see this man Hyde himself, no matter what happened.
Sometimes, when the facts are found, a mystery will disappear,
Utterson thought.
So if I go to talk to Hyde, I might understand why Jekyll wants to give him everything in his will. I also want to meet Hyde for 2 other reasons. My cousin Richard hates him, and Richard likes everybody. Also, he has no kindness for children.
During the next few weeks, Mr. Utterson went to the street where Blackmail House was whenever he could. He would stand by the old door in the early mornings and late at night, waiting for the mysterious man. With a secret smile, Utterson said to himself,
If he is Mr. Hyde, then I shall be Mr. Seek.
Finally, the meeting came. It was a clear night, and the air was beginning to get cold. Winter was coming. The shops near Blackmail House were closed, and Utterson was alone in the small, dark street. It was 10 o'clock, and Utterson was about to give up and go home for the night. Suddenly he heard a strange, light footstep. Utterson felt a chill all over his body. He had a feeling that the man he was looking for was finally here. Just in time, Utterson stepped back into the darkness of the house's courtyard. A small, dark man crossed the street, went to the door, and took out a key. Mr. Utterson came out of the dark and said loudly,
Hello. You are Mr. Hyde, I think.
Chapter 5. Blackmail or Murder? Mr. Hyde looked up in surprise. His mouth opened and he made a hissing sound like a snake. He said coldly,
You surprised me, sir. Hyde is my name. What do you want?
His voice was rough. His eyes looked at Utterson's face quickly, but he kept his head turned away, as if he did not want Utterson to look at him.
I saw that you were about to enter this house,
answered Utterson. He tried to keep his voice calm and cheerful.
My name is Gabriel John Utterson, and I am Jekyll's friend and lawyer. You have probably heard of me. I was about to visit the doctor, and I thought you might let me inside the house. Dr. Jekyll is not at home. How do you know me?
Hyde asked. He was still looking away from Utterson.
Let's make an agreement,
said Utterson.
I will answer your question if you will let me see your face.
Mr. Hyde did not move for a moment. Then he turned and faced Utterson with an angry look. For a long moment the 2 men looked at each other. They seemed to be deciding if the other was dangerous. Then Utterson spoke.
Now I know you,
he said.
This will be useful. Yes,
said Hyde.
It is good that we have met. Also, you should have my address.
He gave Utterson an address in a different area of the city. Utterson knew that part of London, and it was not a nice one.
Has he, too, been thinking about the will?
thought Utterson with fear, but he said nothing.
"Now,"
said Hyde,
"how do you know me?" "Oh, I was told what you look like by a common friend of ours."
Utterson said cheerfully.
"Common friend?"
said Hyde. Utterson noticed that he looked like an animal that has been caught in a trap.
"Who is he?" "Well, Henry Jekyll, for one,"
said Utterson. He suddenly felt afraid of what Hyde could do.
"He never told you anything about me,"
said Hyde. He turned red with anger, and his voice hissed like a snake's.
"I did not think that you were a liar. Oh, now listen. That is not polite language,"
said the lawyer calmly. Hyde snarled aloud like a dog. This sound quickly turned into an evil laugh. Suddenly he spat at Utterson's feet. The next moment he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house, slamming the door behind him. Mr. Utterson stood where Hyde had left him. He felt sick inside. His meeting with Hyde had only given him a little bit of information. Then he turned and walked away, thinking about what had happened. Hyde was pale and short, like a dwarf. He seemed somehow broken and deformed. But even though his face and body were horribly ugly, their shape was normal. His smile was unpleasant, and his behavior was disturbing. He seemed bold, but also terribly afraid of people. But why? Then there was his hoarse, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. But even though he tried, Utterson simply could not explain why this man was so horrible to him. Hyde looked like a human being, but Utterson had the strange feeling that the man was a monster.
"This man is like the devil himself,"
Utterson said.
"To think that Henry has chosen him to receive all his money."
Mr. Utterson walked around the corner. He entered an area that had some old houses that were once beautiful. Now they were broken-looking and dirty, and did not look well cared for. However, there was one house on the street that was better cared for than the others, and looked more comfortable. Mr. Utterson knocked at its door, although it was late at night. The door opened, and a well-dressed, older man looked out.
"Good evening, Poole,"
said the lawyer. Poole was Jekyll's head servant.
"Is Dr. Jekyll at home?" "I will go see Mr. Utterson,"
said Poole. He opened the door wide, and Utterson entered the large hall. There were large wood tables standing on both sides of the room, and a thick, dark red rug on the floor.
"Please wait here by the fire, sir, or would you like to wait in the dining room?"
asked Poole, pointing toward the large, warm fireplace.
"I will wait here by the fire, thank you,"
said Mr. Utterson. Utterson sat by the fire and waited until Poole returned and told him that Dr. Jekyll was not at home. Utterson felt less worried after hearing Poole's words. Casually, the lawyer said,
"I just saw Mr. Hyde enter the house through the old laboratory door, Poole. Does Dr. Jekyll allow him into the house, even when he is not at home?" "Yes, sir. It's quite all right,"
replied Poole.
"Dr. Jekyll gave him a key. The doctor seems to trust that young man quite a lot,"
continued Utterson.
"Yes, he does, sir,"
replied Poole.
"We all have been ordered to obey him as if he were the doctor."
Mr. Utterson turned toward the door. Then, acting as if he had just thought of it, he said,
"I don't remember meeting Mr. Hyde at any of Dr. Jekyll's wonderful dinners."
Poole looked shocked.
"No, sir. Mr. Hyde never dines here. Actually, we almost never see him in this part of the house, in the living rooms. He usually just uses the laboratory." "I see. Well, I must go. Good night, Poole." Good night, Mr. Utterson.
The lawyer walked home feeling very worried about his friend.
Poor Henry Jekyll,
he thought.
I fear something terrible might happen to him. When we were in college together, he was a wild young man, but that was so long ago, and he is such a famous and good man now. Any bad affairs he may have had in the past should have been forgotten. But now it seems that this Mr. Hyde has learned some terrible secret of his and is blackmailing him.
As Utterson came close to home, he realized that Mr. Hyde also looked like a man with many secrets and terrible acts to hide. Utterson knew that Hyde was already doing one horrible act, blackmail. He feared that this strange man might be planning an even worse crime, murder.
Henry is in great danger,
thought Utterson.
If that monster Hyde learns that he will receive all Jekyll's money, he may decide to get it all quickly. He may kill Jekyll.
Utterson suddenly felt full of determination. He would go see Henry Jekyll. He would find a way to help his oldest friend. He would protect Jekyll from Mr. Hyde and any other troubles he faced, no matter what happened. And together, he and Jekyll would end the power that Hyde had over the doctor. Chapter 6. A Lawyer's Promise. Just a few days later, Mr. Utterson was invited to a dinner party at Henry Jekyll's house. This was quite lucky, because of his determination to help his friend. Jekyll had invited 5 other old friends also, and the conversation was intelligent and interesting. Jekyll always served excellent food and wine at his parties. When the other men had left, Mr. Utterson stayed. He and Jekyll would stay up late into the night after these dinners. It was always wonderful to sit in front of the fire, talking softly after the exciting conversation of the evening. Tonight, Utterson watched Henry Jekyll carefully, but he could not see any change in the friend he had known for so many years. Although Jekyll had been close friends with both Utterson and Lanyon at school, he was younger than they. He had been a young genius and had entered university at a young age. Now Jekyll was more than 50 years old, but he looked much younger. His face always looked kindly, and his eyes had a bit of hidden mystery in them. But as Mr. Utterson examined him, his face looked calm and happy as he poured 2 glasses of wine for himself and Mr. Utterson as they relaxed in large, comfortable chairs. Mr. Utterson waited until his friend had finished his glass of wine and said,
Henry, my friend, I have wanted to speak with you in private. I have some questions about your will.
The doctor's young face suddenly looked a bit uncomfortable, but he replied cheerfully,
My dear Utterson, no lawyer should be as unlucky as to have me for a client. You seem so worried and upset for me. I have not seen many people ever look so worried. No, that is not true. I have often seen Lanyon more worried and upset by my own scientific ideas. Ideas which he believes are crazy because they go against common opinions. Now, don't worry for me, Utterson. I know Lanyon is a good man, but he's also the most stubborn man I know. I am very disappointed in Lanyon, most disappointed than I have ever been with a man before.
Utterson did not want to change the subject and continued to speak.
You know, Jekyll, I never liked your will. I told you when you first gave it to me. Yes, I know,
said Jekyll with a little anger in his voice.
You have told me many times. And now I must tell you again,
said the lawyer,
because I learned something terrible about Mr. Hyde.
Jekyll's large, handsome face became pale, and a strange light appeared in his eyes.
I don't want to talk any more about this topic,
he said firmly and coldly.
I just want...
began Utterson.
No, it does not matter what you have heard. It does not make a difference.
Jekyll spoke quickly and nervously.
My mind is decided, and it will not be changed by talk. So we will not speak any more about this conversation. I just want to help you,
Utterson replied calmly.
We have been friends for a long time. You know you can trust me. Please tell me the story in private, and I will do everything I can to help you.
With a hard effort, Jekyll became calm.
Utterson, my dear friend, you are always so good to me. Of course, I trust you as the closest friend I have. I trust you more than myself. But I do not need any help. My situation is not so bad. It is not what you think. But my affair is a private one. I don't want you to worry, so I will say one thing. I can make Mr. Hyde disappear at any moment I wish. I promise you that. But I still thank you many times for your friendship.
Utterson decided not to say any more.
I trust that you know what is best,
he said as he stood up.
Well, it is getting late, and I should return home.
Jekyll stood up with his friend and walked him to the door.
I wish to say just one more thing about this subject before we forget it forever,
said Jekyll.
Hyde is a strange man, but I have a great interest in him. He told me that you had met him, and I fear he was rude to you. Still, old friend, I want you to promise me something. What? If for some reason I disappear, will you defend poor Hyde? Though he has a strange personality, please see that he receives everything I want him to have. I believe that you would do this for me if you knew everything about Hyde. I can't say that I will ever like that man,
said the lawyer.
I am not asking you to like him,
said Jekyll, putting his hand on Utterson's shoulder.
I only want him to be treated fairly. Help Hyde for me when I am no longer here.
Utterson nodded his head to agree, but his face was very sad.
Yes, my friend,
he said.
I promise.
Chapter 7. Detective Newcomb. For the next year, Utterson did not see Mr. Hyde. Indeed, there were no strange happenings in this time. Utterson scolded himself for worrying about Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as he had. Jekyll seemed as normal as ever. Therefore, when Mr. Newcomb, a police detective, came to see Mr. Utterson, it was a huge shock. Early one morning, Utterson's servant woke him and told him that a police detective was waiting downstairs and wanted to speak with him immediately. Utterson dressed quickly and ran downstairs to meet the detective. Utterson entered the living room, where the detective was waiting for him. He was surprised to see a young woman wearing a maid's uniform, sitting on one of his old chairs, crying. A policeman stood next to her, and the detective, Mr. Newcomb, was writing in a small notebook. The detective apologized to Utterson for coming at such an early hour. Then he asked the lawyer to come with him into another room so he could explain the reason for his visit and about the young woman.
A terrible crime happened in the middle of last night,
said the detective.
That girl is a maid, and she is the only person who saw the crime. We came here because we believe you can help us. I want you to hear the maid's story and tell me what you think. It is a bit hard for her to speak right now because she is quite frightened by what she has seen."
Mr. Utterson nodded that he understood, and the two men went back into the living room. The girl tried to stop crying and looked up at Mr. Utterson with large blue eyes. The woman seemed more frightened by the large, expensive house than she was by the policeman at her side. She sat uncomfortably in the expensive chair and did not dare lay her arms on its clean wooden arms.
"Now, Sarah,"
said the detective firmly,
"this is Mr. Utterson. He would like to hear your story. Stop crying now, please."
Though her eyes had begun to fill with tears again, Sarah controlled herself and began speaking. "Yes, sir, I'll try to speak clearly, sir. I had finished my work and went to my room at around 11 o'clock. Then, while I was sitting at my desk and looking out the window at the moon, I saw a fine old gentleman walking down the street." Utterson interrupted.
"You say that you were looking at the moon?"
Sarah turned a little red. "Yes, sir. I can see the river from my window, and the moon looks so beautiful shining on it. It looks like a picture from the storybooks I used to read when I was a young girl in school." The detective grew tired of her description and said quickly,
"Yes, please continue your story. You saw the man walking?"
Sarah nodded, and a few tears ran down her face. "He was wearing such nice clothing, and I knew that he must be a kind gentleman, because he smiled so kindly at Mr. Hyde."
"Mr. Hyde!"
Utterson exclaimed when he heard the name. "Oh, yes, it was definitely Mr. Hyde," Sarah said. "I know him because he sometimes visits the house where I work. He is so strange-looking and angry. None of the servants like him, and we all try to avoid him." Now the detective interrupted again, for the story was becoming complicated. He explained to Utterson that two men happened to meet on the road that Sarah was watching from her window. The older man seemed to ask the second man for directions, for he bowed politely and pointed his finger down the road. The second man looked like Mr. Hyde. The detective ordered Sarah to continue her story. "Mr. Hyde didn't answer him. I could see that he didn't open his mouth. He then began waving his big cane in the air and seemed to want the old gentleman to leave. He jumped up and down, almost like he was crazy with anger. Well, of course, the old gentleman was surprised, and he took a few steps back. I think he must have been a little afraid. I was certainly afraid, and I was safe inside. But as soon as the man stepped back, Mr. Hyde jumped at him. He lifted up his big cane and then hit the gentleman on the head hard. The gentleman fell down onto one knee, and Hyde just kept hitting him. When the gentleman fell down, Mr. Hyde jumped right on him and kept jumping up and down on his body and head. He was acting just like an animal in the zoo. And then, I don't know any more."
"She had fainted,"
explained the detective.
"When she woke up, it was 2 o'clock this morning. Of course, Mr. Hyde was gone, but the man still lay in the road dead. The body was in very bad condition. We found the bottom half of the cane in the street. The man was hit so hard that it broke, even though it was made from heavy and strong wood. The murderer must have carried the top half of the cane away with him."
Mr. Utterson suddenly felt his legs become weak, and he sat down quickly. He was afraid to hear the answer, but he asked anyway.
"Who did Hyde kill?" "We are not sure yet,"
replied the detective.
"His face was hit so hard that we can't tell who it is. That is why we have come to see you. The old man has a purse and a gold watch, but no papers with his name. But we found a letter in his pocket that is addressed to you. We think that the man was looking for a post-box and asked Hyde where to find one."
Mr. Utterson controlled his fears and followed the detective to the police station. There, the lawyer was led into a small room, where the body of the man lay under an old thin blanket. When the blanket was pulled away from the face, Mr. Utterson let out a cry of shock.
"This is Sir Danvers Carew. He was a member of Parliament and one of my clients." "My God!"
exclaimed the detective.
"This is a terrible murder. Certainly everyone will be talking about it soon. It is lucky that we already know who the murderer is. Now we only have to go and find him."
Utterson turned his head away from the dead man's face.
"Perhaps I can help you find him,"
he said.
"I have met this Mr. Hyde before, and I know his address."
Chapter 8. Hyde's Disappearance. The detective prepared some men to follow them to Mr. Hyde's house. Before leaving the police station, the detective showed Mr. Utterson the cane that Hyde had murdered the man with. After seeing the cane, the lawyer had no doubts that Edward Hyde had murdered the man. He saw that the cane was one he had given Henry Jekyll many years before. The detective called for a carriage, and the lawyer gave the driver directions to Mr. Hyde's house. Mr. Hyde lived in a poor part of London, which was full of many thieves and murderers. It was now late morning, and the street was full of people. A thick fog had strangely come into the city, even though it was not the season. The carriage moved slowly through the dark fog. Utterson felt a cold, nervous energy run through him, as he saw the evil population of the area walk about the deep fog. The carriage let them out in front of an old house on a dirty street. Thin, dirty children sat in the doorways, and men and women of many nationalities walked drunkenly around. On one side of the street was a wine shop, and on the other side was a cheap restaurant. Utterson thought that the restaurant surely didn't get many customers, because the smells coming from inside were so bad. Utterson and the detective climbed the old steps up to Hyde's apartment. The lawyer could not believe it.
"So, this horrible place is the home of Henry Jekyll's new best friend, the home of a man who will inherit £250,000,
thought Utterson. The detective knocked on the door of the building. The landlady was so angry about being disturbed that she screamed curses as she came to the door. However, when she saw the detective, she tried to look more polite. The detective immediately demanded to know where Edward Hyde was. The landlady replied that he was not there. "He came in for a short time, very late last night, sir, but he left again soon after," she explained. "He is an odd man, sir, and he always comes and goes at strange times." She told the detective all this information freely, but when he asked to see Hyde's rooms, she would not let him come in. Now Utterson opened his mouth for the first time.
"You listen, woman. I'll tell you who this man you are refusing is. He is Detective Newcomb."
The woman let out an ugly laugh. "Ah, Mr. Hyde is in trouble. What terrible thing has he done?" The men did not answer, and they looked at each other.
I see that Hyde was not liked here, just like everywhere else,"
said Newcomb. Knowing now that her visitors were important men, the woman led them into the building to see Hyde's rooms. The building was old and in terrible condition, which made the men very surprised to see the apartment. Hyde's rooms were not at all poor, but instead filled with beautiful furniture and nice things. There were cloth napkins, silver forks and knives, and a huge closet filled to the top with good wine. There were soft rugs on the floor and fancy paintings on the walls. Utterson wondered if the paintings were given to Hyde by Jekyll, who had a lot of nice paintings also. The men noticed that it looked like the rooms had been robbed. All the drawers were open and clothes lay all over the floor. They could also tell that many papers had been taken out of the desk and burned in the fireplace. The detective began searching for information. In the fireplace he found a green checkbook. Part of it was burned, but he could still read the name of the bank written on it. In the closet he found the top half of Hyde's heavy cane, the murder weapon. This made it even clearer that Hyde was the murderer. The detective and Utterson left the building and went straight to the bank named on the green checkbook. There, they learned that Hyde had many £1,000s in his bank account. For some reason, the detective was happy to learn this news.
"Now, sir,"
he said to Utterson,
"we have almost caught him. He must have left quickly, or else he wouldn't have left the cane and burned his checkbook. He'll certainly need to get his money out of the bank, and will come to get it. We'll leave a picture of him in the bank, and they will tell us when he arrives."
Though the detective's ideas were good, his plans were not successful. They could not find any photographs of Hyde, and his family could not be found. An artist tried to draw a picture of Hyde's face from the descriptions of Utterson, his landlady, and the maid Sarah. But the attempt was a failure. Everyone described Hyde differently. The only one thing they all agreed on could not help the artist, that Hyde was frightening to look at. The police now increased their efforts to find Mr. Edward Hyde, the murderer of a member of Parliament. Chapter 9. Hyde's Letter. After leaving the detective, Utterson went home and wrote all the details he could remember about the death of Sir Carew. He finished writing late in the afternoon. Afterwards, the lawyer ran directly to Dr. Jekyll's home, where Poole greeted him. When Utterson asked to see the doctor, he was led through the house, out the back door, and across the yard. Utterson remembered that a surgeon had owned the house before Jekyll. The surgeon used to teach classes in his laboratory. Poole led the lawyer toward this old laboratory. Many years ago, the yard had been a garden, but now it was empty, dark, and cold. As they crossed the yard to the laboratory, Utterson realized that Jekyll had never shown him this part of his house. The laboratory was full of tables, and the tables were covered with tools and bottles of brightly colored liquids. There were open boxes all over the floor. In the back of the laboratory, there was a door that led into Jekyll's office. Poole knocked and then slowly opened the door. The office was quite large, with 3 dirty windows that faced out into the yard. All the furniture was quite normal, except for a tall mirror standing in one corner, the kind of mirror that one uses for dressing. The fog was still thick outside, so everything in the room was dark. All the lamps in the room were lit. There was a large fire burning in the fireplace, and Dr. Jekyll was sitting in front of it. His face was very pale, and he did not stand to meet Utterson. However, Jekyll held out a cold hand, and welcomed Utterson in a thin and weak voice, as if it was painful for him to speak. Once Poole left the room, Utterson said,
"It seems that you have heard the news."
Jekyll's body shook.
"I heard people yelling in the square."
Utterson spoke in his business voice, so Jekyll would understand that his words were from his lawyer, not his friend.
"Sir Carew was one of my clients, Jekyll, and so are you. I want to ask you a question as your lawyer. You would not make the mistake of hiding Mr. Hyde, would you? Utterson, as you are my lawyer and my friend, I promise you I will never see Hyde again,"
cried Jekyll.
"I will never see that man again. I am finished with him forever. You must believe me."
Jekyll then stood up in front of Utterson and waved one of his hands towards the window in a strange way.
"Hyde is safe. He is safe and does not need or want my help. I know that man better than you do, and I know that he will never be seen again."
The lawyer listened to all that Jekyll said carefully. He was worried by Jekyll's strange behavior.
"You seem very sure of what this man will do,"
he said slowly,
"and I hope you are right. However, if he is found and there is a trial, your name will surely appear. It would be very bad for your good name." "It is all right. Yes. Surely he is gone forever,"
exclaimed Jekyll.
"I cannot tell you or anyone why I am sure, but I am."
He then paused for a moment and then continued in a calmer voice.
"As my lawyer, I need your advice in one matter. I received a letter this morning, and I'm not sure if I should show it to the police."
Utterson's usually calm face suddenly became bright with interest.
"Is it a letter from Hyde?"
Jekyll nodded.
"Are you afraid that the letter may cause him to be captured?" "No,"
Jekyll replied quickly.
"I do not care what happens to Hyde. I am only worried about my own good name. So I want to give you the letter and let you decide what to do with it. I trust you both as my friend and my lawyer to do what is best, and I know you will act wisely."
Utterson thought about it for a moment. He was a bit surprised that Jekyll had such a selfish view of the situation, but he was also relieved. Perhaps Jekyll really was finished with Hyde.
"Let me see the letter,"
he said at last. Jekyll handed Utterson a letter written in a very strange handwriting. At the bottom it was signed Edward Hyde. It was a short letter. It said first that Jekyll had been very kind to Hyde, even though Hyde certainly did not deserve this kindness. Then it said that Dr. Jekyll did not need to worry about Hyde's safety. The letter promised that Hyde had a way to escape London that was sure to be successful. Utterson felt relieved by the letter. It was not the kind of letter that a blackmailer would send to his victim. He nodded his head and asked,
"Where is the envelope?" "I burned it before I realized that it might be important,"
replied Jekyll.
"However, there was no address or postmark, for it was brought to me by a messenger. Well, I will keep the letter and think about what you should do,"
said Utterson.
"Thank you, my dear friend,"
said Jekyll with a deep breath.
"I have lost all confidence in myself. From now on, I want you to make all my decisions. I have another question that you must answer,"
said the lawyer, again using his sharp voice.
"Did Hyde force you to write that will?"
The doctor became pale. Then he nodded his head sadly.
"I knew it,"
cried Utterson.
"He was planning to murder you. Your life has been in great danger. Yes, I see now that it has been,
replied Jekyll quietly.
I have learned many things from this. My God, what a terrible affair this has been.
Jekyll began to cry and covered his face with his hands. After Jekyll became quiet again, Utterson put a hand on his shoulder and told him that he would take care of everything. He then left the house the same way he came in. He could have left directly through the laboratory, but he did not wish to, for it was the same door where he had stood waiting to meet Hyde for so many nights. Poole opened the front door for the lawyer, saying,
Good afternoon, Mr. Utterson.
As he walked out, Utterson turned back to Poole and asked,
Poole, a messenger delivered a letter here today. Tell me, can you remember what he looked like?
Poole shook his head.
No, sir. No special messages have come today. I always handle all the mail. Today the doctor received only a few normal business letters. There have been no messengers today. Of this I am sure.
Chapter 10. A Study of Two Handwritings. Mr. Utterson walked home slowly. He was thinking deeply about the letter he had in his pocket. Since Poole had not seen a messenger, the letter must have been brought to the laboratory door. Perhaps Hyde had used his key to enter the laboratory and had written the letter in the doctor's office. In his heart, Utterson was worried that Hyde might not have truly written the letter. He decided to show the letter to a person whose opinions he trusted, Mr. Guest, his long-time employee. Mr. Utterson told his servant to make a fire in the library fireplace and bring in a good bottle of wine. He then invited Mr. Guest into the library for a chat and filled 2 glasses. Mr. Guest was one of the most intelligent men that Utterson knew. Guest was also interested in some uncommon activities, like the study of people's handwriting. The lawyer had decided to show him Hyde's letter and ask him if he could tell him anything about the handwriting. Mr. Guest had known Dr. Jekyll for many years, and Utterson had told him about Hyde's friendship with him. The lawyer did not keep any secrets from his employee, mostly because he had learned a long time ago that Mr. Guest was a man of great honor, especially about all things relating to business. Utterson knew that Mr. Guest would be silent on the matter of Hyde. Guest was a silent man, maybe as silent as Utterson himself. He was also like his employer in his love of good wine. The 2 men sat silently together for several minutes, drinking their wine slowly. Mr. Guest held the wine glass up and looked at it with great appreciation. He smiled.
Mr. Utterson, sir, we have tasted many fine wines together, but this one I believe is the best. Yes, I agree with you. Most excellent, Mr. Guest.
Utterson let a few more minutes pass while they tasted the wine. Then he sat up a little and said,
This terrible affair about Sir Danvers is very sad. Sad for us and for all of London. Yes, sir, the people are quite angry about the cruelty of the crime, especially against a man of the Parliament. The murderer must be crazy.
Mr. Utterson moved his head closer to Guest and spoke in a low voice.
I want to ask for your opinion about that subject. After you have studied this letter, it was written in the murderer's own handwriting. I am not yet sure what to do with it. Really, sir? A letter written by the murderer? Quite interesting indeed.
Mr. Guest's calm voice sounded a little bit excited, though perhaps it was just the effects of the wine. Utterson had given him the wine for just that reason. Mr. Utterson handed the letter to Mr. Guest.
This letter is, of course, completely private.
Mr. Guest nodded his head and immediately put down his wine and studied the letter.
This handwriting is very strange, but it does not seem that this man is crazy.
Just then the servant came in with a note. Mr. Utterson put it down on the table. Mr. Guest looked at it.
"Is that a letter from Dr. Jekyll, sir?"
he asked. Mr. Utterson nodded his head.
"I thought I recognized his handwriting,"
continued Mr. Guest.
"Is it a private note, Mr. Utterson?" "No, it's just a dinner invitation." "Why? Would you like to see it?" "Could I? Just for a minute,"
said Mr. Guest as he picked up Dr. Jekyll's note and held it beside Hyde's letter. He stared at the two and nodded his head several times. At last he put both papers down on the table.
"Thank you, sir. I am finished studying them. Most interesting."
Again the room became silent. Mr. Utterson could see that his employee was, as usual, keeping his ideas to himself. So he reached out and lightly hit his hand on the back of his employee's chair and said,
"Well, Mr. Guest, no need for secrets with me. Why did you compare the two? What have you discovered?"
Mr. Guest answered calmly.
"Well, sir, the two handwritings are very similar. In many ways, they are exactly the same, except the letters slope differently." "Are you saying that they are the same except for the slope of the letters?"
cried Utterson in surprise.
"Yes, sir,"
said Guest as he reached for his glass again. Mr. Utterson was not thinking about the wine now.
"Mr. Guest, I must remind you that this is a private matter,"
he said quietly. His clerk nodded.
"Oh, yes, I understand, sir."
Then Guest stood up and returned to his office. When Guest left the room, Utterson sat still for a while, thinking. Then, suddenly, like he had come to a decision, the lawyer stood up and locked Hyde's letter away in his safe, planning never to take it out again. As he closed the safe door, he thought to himself,
"The people of London cannot know that Henry Jekyll, my client and dear friend, has forged a letter for a violent murderer in order to trick the police."
Chapter 11. Dr. Lanyon's Last Days. The London government promised a reward of many £1,000 for anybody who could capture Mr. Hyde. People came to the police office daily to tell of Hyde's terrible life and of his cruel and violent actions. But no one had any idea where he was. Privately, Mr. Utterson almost felt that the horrible murder was worth it. At least, Hyde had disappeared. Now that his friendship with Hyde was finished, Dr. Jekyll began a new life. He stopped spending so much time in his laboratory, and again was a regular guest or host to his friends at wonderful dinner parties. He again began his charitable work with the poor and started going to church again. Even his appearance became more bright and happy. This period lasted for more than 2 months, during which time Utterson saw Jekyll almost daily. Then one day Utterson came to see Jekyll, but Poole told him at the door that the doctor was at home, but not seeing anyone. The lawyer knew at once that something was wrong. The same thing happened the next day and the next. Poole told Utterson that the doctor was not ill, but had ordered that no one should disturb him. In the next week, all of Jekyll's charitable work stopped, and that Sunday he was not in church. He did not leave the house, and no one could go in. Utterson, already very worried by Jekyll's actions, decided to go see Dr. Lanyon. He wanted to hear Lanyon's advice, both as a friend of his and Jekyll's and as a doctor. When he arrived at Lanyon's house, he found the doctor in a terrible condition. Lanyon's large body had become very small, and his healthy face had become pale. He spoke in a frightened voice, and Utterson realized that Lanyon was soon going to die. The doctor looked up at Utterson and said in a voice that was not much stronger than a whisper,
"I have had a terrible shock, my friend. I fear that I shall never recover from it. I used to enjoy life. However, now that I have seen what I have done, I cannot enjoy it any longer. I think that if everyone knew what I did, we would all be glad to die. Jekyll is also ill. Ill in his mind, that is,"
said Utterson.
"Have you seen him recently?"
The lawyer knew that the two men had become friends again in these last 2 months. But Lanyon became even paler when he heard Jekyll's name. He held up a shaking hand.
"I hope that I will never again have to see Henry Jekyll or even hear his name,"
he cried.
"I think of him as dead." "Lanyon, you speak too strongly,"
said Utterson softly.
"We three are old friends. We should not be so cruel to old friends. No, nothing can be done to make me see him again,"
replied the dying man.
"Go see Jekyll for yourself."
Utterson shook his head.
"He won't see me. I am not surprised,"
said Lanyon.
"Some day, my friend, after I am dead, you may understand why I cannot see him. I cannot speak with you about it. Now, sit with me and talk to me of anything except Henry Jekyll."
Utterson stayed with his old friend for several hours, talking about their lives together and other happy things. As soon as he arrived home, he wrote a letter to Jekyll, asking why he could not come to visit him, and asking what he could do to help with the problems between Jekyll and Lanyon. The next day a strange letter came from Jekyll. The letter was long and full of horrible sadness. It said that the fight between Lanyon and himself could not be changed. Jekyll also wrote,
"You must not doubt my friendship, even though I cannot see you. A terrible illness has taken me that I cannot name. If I am the king of bad deeds, then I am also the king of suffering. Forget about me, old friend. I must travel my own dark way."
Utterson did not know what to think of Jekyll's letter. Since Mr. Hyde had left his life, Jekyll had again become his old self. Now Jekyll was unhappy once more. Again he had left the life of good deeds and friendship. For what? What illness of the mind had taken him? Utterson did not know what the cause of Jekyll's problems was, but he felt sure that Lanyon knew the answer. A few days later, Lanyon died. The day after the funeral, Utterson was given an envelope that Lanyon had left for him. On the front was written,
"Private. To be delivered to G.J. Utterson alone. To be opened only after the death of H. Lanyon."
From inside the envelope, the lawyer pulled out another envelope. This envelope was closed, and on it Lanyon had written,
"Not to be opened until the death or disappearance of Henry Jekyll."
Utterson took a surprised breath. He had seen the word disappearance before. It was in Jekyll's strange will. But Utterson knew that Hyde had made Jekyll write that part of the will. Why would Lanyon use the word also? The lawyer wanted to open the envelope at once, but his honor as a lawyer stopped him. He walked slowly over to his safe and put the letter in it. Utterson continued going to visit Jekyll every day, but he could only speak to Poole. The lawyer was told that the doctor almost never left the laboratory. He usually slept there, and he spoke to no one. After a few weeks, with Poole's reports the same every day, Utterson stopped trying to visit Dr. Jekyll. There was no way for him to help a man he was not allowed to see. Chapter 12. Conversation from the Window. All this time, Mr. Utterson continued his Sunday walks with his cousin Richard Enfield. One day they were in the street where Richard had first shown his cousin the strange door and told him the story of Hyde and the small girl. When they came near the blackmail house, they stopped and stared at it.
"Well,"
said Richard,
"the story of Hyde is at an end. We'll never see him again."
"I hope you are right about that,"
said Utterson.
"Did I tell you I met him a few months ago? He was a horrible man, just like you said. I think it would be impossible to see Hyde and not feel he was a terrible and scary man,"
Richard said.
"Perhaps I forgot to tell you, but I finally realized that this door is the back way into Dr. Jekyll's house."
"Poor Jekyll,"
said Mr. Utterson, his head turned sadly to the door.
"I am very worried about him recently. Poole, his butler, tells me he almost never leaves his laboratory and office. Perhaps he is in there now. Come with me, Richard. Let's go closer to the house."
Richard nodded his head and followed his cousin across the street into Jekyll's cool, dead courtyard. The lawyer stopped under one of the windows of the second floor and looked up. A man was sitting just inside one window, which was open.
"It's him,"
said Utterson, smiling as he waved his hands and called out,
"Henry Jekyll, is that you?"
Dr. Jekyll came to the window and hung his head out. His face was filled with a deep sadness. He looked outside of the window as if he were a prisoner. When he saw that it was Utterson outside, he greeted him by lifting a hand weakly.
"Are you feeling any better, my friend?"
said Utterson.
"I am weak, Utterson,"
Jekyll answered slowly.
"Very weak. It will not last much longer, though, thank God."
His voice was very thin, and the two men outside could hardly hear it.
"You would perhaps feel better outside. You have been in your office too much,"
said the lawyer.
"You should come out and get a little exercise. By the way, this is my cousin, Richard Enfield. Richard, this is Dr. Henry Jekyll."
Richard looked up at Jekyll and bowed.
"It is a pleasure to meet you,"
he called up pleasantly.
"My cousin is right. Exercise would do you well. Won't you join us on our walk? It's a fine day out."
Jekyll took a long, deep breath. It sounded like he was in great pain.
"You are most kind, sir. I would very much like to join you, but it is not possible. I dare not."
Jekyll tried to sit up straight and look normal.
"But indeed, Utterson, my friend, I am happy to see you. I would like to invite you and Mr. Enfield up, but the office is dirty right now and not fit for entertaining." "Why, then,"
replied Utterson cheerfully,
"perhaps we can continue our conversation from where we are."
A sad smile came upon the doctor's face.
"Yes, that is just what I was going to suggest."
A moment after speaking these words, Jekyll's smile disappeared from his face. His eyes filled with fear and his face twisted into an expression of horror. The two men below cried out when they saw his face, asking if he was all right. They could only see the terrible look for a second, for Jekyll closed the window hard and fast and disappeared into the office. Utterson and Richard stood unable to move. Then, at the same time, they turned around and walked out of the courtyard in silence. Mr. Utterson's face had become pale as they walked away from the strange and horrible sight. Richard, though as white as his cousin, was younger and stronger, and he put his hand under the lawyer's arm, helping him to walk. Neither man spoke the whole way home. Chapter 13. The Search for a Strange Medicine. Mr. Utterson was reading a book in his library one evening when his servant entered to tell him that Poole was in the hall, wanting to speak to him immediately.
"Yes, of course. Show him in,"
said the lawyer. A moment later, Poole entered the library, his face pale and his body shaking.
"My God, Poole,"
exclaimed Mr. Utterson.
"what's the problem? You look terribly ill. Or is the doctor ill? Come and sit by the fire." "Mr. Utterson,"
cried Poole,
"something is very wrong with the doctor." "Please, calm yourself, Poole,"
said the lawyer.
"Sit down and have a glass of wine with me. When you have your breath back, you can tell me what the problem is."
Utterson was very professional at calming upset clients. Poole obeyed him and sat down.
"Sir, you know the doctor has been staying in his office these weeks. He almost never comes out. We just bring him food every day. I have not seen him for a week, so I'm afraid." "Afraid?"
asked the lawyer.
"Tell me what you are afraid of, and I will help."
Poole did not seem to hear Utterson.
"I've been very afraid for a week now."
His voice became louder.
"I can't bear the situation at the house any longer. None of the servants can."
Utterson faced Poole and spoke a little more sharply.
"Poole, tell me exactly what you are afraid of."
Poole looked into the lawyer's eyes.
"Murder, Mr. Utterson. I don't know how, but I think there's been a murder."
Utterson was shocked to hear mention of murder and sat up all the way in his chair. He asked Poole for more details, but Poole, usually a calm and clear-thinking man, was too terrified to speak. All he would say was that Utterson should come to Jekyll's house and see for himself. At once, Utterson called for his hat and coat. This made Poole a little calmer. The night was cold and the wind was wild. The moon was pale white and shining brightly. As they walked, the wind blew so loud that talking became difficult, so neither man spoke. Mr. Utterson was trying to remain calm and prepare himself for what he might see. However, he feared that something terrible had happened to his friend, and this made him hurry. Poole walked up to Jekyll's front door and knocked softly. The door opened, but the chain was still fastened. Utterson heard a woman's voice ask, "Is that you, Poole?"
"It's me and Mr. Utterson. Open the door."
They entered into the hall, and the lawyer noticed a group of people sitting close around a fire. The group turned their nervous faces toward Utterson, and he saw that they were Jekyll's servants. A young maid was crying loudly. Suddenly, Jekyll's cook ran to him, waving her hands wildly and crying, "Thank God! Mr. Utterson, you must help us!"
"What is happening here?"
said the lawyer.
"Why are you all here in the hall?"
Poole answered for all of them.
"We're afraid,"
he said. Then he picked up a candle and added,
"Please, sir, come with me to the laboratory. Be completely silent and just listen."
If Dr. Jekyll asks to see you, don't go in."
Utterson was surprised by this strange advice, but he did not say anything. He followed Poole up the stairs to the office door. Poole knocked, saying,
"Sir, Mr. Utterson is asking to see you."
He raised his hand to his ear to show Utterson that he should listen. A strange voice from inside the office said,
"Tell him that I am busy and cannot see anyone." "I will, sir,"
said Poole, and they quickly went back down the stairs.
"Now, Mr. Utterson, did that sound like my master's voice?"
Utterson thought for a moment and said slowly,
"No, it's changed." "Changed? Not changed, sir,"
cried Poole.
"That is not his voice at all. My master is dead. That voice is Mr. Hyde's. I recognize it from when he was staying here before. Hyde is in that office pretending to be Dr. Jekyll. 8 days ago, we heard the master make a terrible cry, calling on God. Since that day, this strange voice has been answering me when I knock and giving me orders."
Mr. Utterson realized that he was sweating from nervousness.
"Your story is a wild one, and I cannot understand it, Poole. Why would a murderer stay in the room after he's done his killing? And for 8 more days? That wouldn't be very smart." "I don't know how to answer that question, sir,"
said Poole.
"but I know my master's voice. Hyde, or whoever is now living in that office, has been ordering me to find some special medicine every day and night. Before, when Dr. Jekyll was working, he would write down any medicines he needed on a piece of paper and leave the paper on the stairs for me. I would then take the notes to the medicine stores. Well, this past week, he has been leaving me notes every hour. I have done nothing but run to different stores."
Utterson shook his head.
"Perhaps he is working on an important experiment. He often works on experiments using many medicines. There's nothing strange about that, is there?" "Wait, sir. I haven't finished telling you all the details. Each time I bring some medicine, the doctor says that it is not the right one. Each time he sends me back to the chemist, along with an order to return the drug I have just brought home. I don't know what kind of medicine he is looking for, but you can see he wants it desperately." "Do you have any of these notes?"
asked Utterson. Poole reached into his pockets and pulled out a few small pieces of paper. Moving over to the light of a candle, Mr. Utterson read,
"Dr. Jekyll gives his greetings to Mr. Ma, chemist. I wish to tell you that the last medicine you sent me was impure and of bad quality. 2 years ago, I bought a large quantity of this same medicine, and I wish to find the same good quality as I received then. Please, search your store for more of that same kind of medicine. I am willing to pay any amount of money."
The letter sounded normal and professional at first, but soon it became strangely full of emotion. The handwriting in the second half of the letter was hard to read, and the words said,
"For God's sake, quickly find me some of the old."
Mr. Utterson looked up to Poole.
"You are right. This is most strange. Why is the letter not in an envelope, Poole? Are you daring to open his letters?" "No, sir. When I delivered the envelope to the chemist, the man became angry and threw it back at me. He said that they had already sent their best medicines to him, and that they did not want to send more, and have him return them again."
The lawyer looked again at the paper in his hand.
I have seen Jekyll's handwriting many times, and I would say that he definitely wrote this letter. Do you disagree with me, Poole?
Poole shook his head sadly.
No, sir. You are right. This is definitely his handwriting. But now I must tell you the worst part of my story. I have seen this person in the office, this thing. One evening, it left the office to look in the boxes in the laboratory just as I came in through the garden entrance.
Mr. Utterson stood very still.
Please, continue, Poole. He saw me coming in and let out a strange cry. Then he ran quickly up the stairs and back into the office. He closed the door so loudly that it almost broke off.
Poole's voice became scared and he began to whisper.
Why would my master have hid his face from me? Why would he cry out like an animal and run from me?
Mr. Utterson tried to think of a reasonable explanation, as lawyers are trained to do.
I agree that these are very strange things, Poole. But there must be an explanation. Perhaps Dr. Jekyll has become ill with a sickness that has affected his skin. That is why he covered his face, and why he hides from his friends. And of course, he is now searching for a cure, so he has sent you from chemist to chemist looking for medicine. I think that this must be what is happening.
Now Poole stood up as tall as he could and spoke out firmly and bravely, with none of his usual politeness.
No, sir, I must disagree. That man I saw in the laboratory was very short, a dwarf even, not my master, who is very tall. That thing in there is not Dr. Jekyll. It does not have his body, his face, or his voice. No, I tell you that Dr. Jekyll has been murdered. I promise you that.
For many minutes Utterson thought about Poole's words. Finally he said,
Poole, if you are sure about what you say, then there is only one thing to do. We must go get tools from the house, and then break down the door to that office.
Chapter 14. The Office Door. Poole's eyes lit up when he heard Utterson's words.
Yes, sir,
he cried.
That is what I was hoping you would say. Well, Poole, what tools do you have around here that we can use to break the door? We have 2 heavy tools, sir. I already have them prepared downstairs. One is an axe to open boxes, and one is a tool to turn wood in the fireplace.
Poole picked up the axe and handed the fireplace tool to the lawyer. The tool was heavy, and Mr. Utterson felt its weight in his hand.
This is a strong tool,
he said.
I am hoping that I will not need to use this for protection. But I think both of us fear that maybe Mr. Hyde really is behind that door. Yes, sir, I fear he may be. Before we go in, I want you to tell me what you saw again. Did you recognize that person in the laboratory, even though he covered his face with his hands?
Poole did not stop to think.
He moved quickly up the stairs, and he was covering his face so that another man might not recognize him. But I am sure that it was Mr. Hyde. He never returned his key to the laboratory door. Also, have you ever met Mr. Hyde, sir? Yes,
said the lawyer.
Just once. Even if you only met him once, you would know that there is something very horrible about him. Just looking at his face is quite scary. I admit that you are right. Well, sir, when I saw that
animal of a man jump up and run into the doctor's office, a feeling like ice ran all through my body. That's why I am sure it was Mr. Hyde. I have worried about this for a long time. In his will, Jekyll left all his money to Hyde. Now, Hyde has murdered poor Henry for his money.
Utterson looked at the group of servants still sitting around the fire in the hall. He pointed a finger at one and said to Poole,
"Tell that man to come over here."
Poole called the man over. Though he was a large man with huge arms, he was pale and nervous. Still, he listened closely to Mr. Utterson's instructions. He was told to go get one of the bigger servant boys from the kitchen and some tools that could be used as weapons. The two of them were to wait in the street and guard the laboratory door in case Mr. Hyde tried to escape or run away from both Poole and Utterson.
"I will wait 10 minutes for you to get your tools and go to your positions,"
said the lawyer.
"Then we are going up to the room."
After the man left, Utterson and Poole went to wait at the bottom of the stairs. Utterson looked at his watch. He whispered to Poole that they should wait 10 minutes. They could hear footsteps inside Jekyll's office, walking around and around.
"He walks around like that all day, sir,"
whispered Poole.
"and sometimes he walks all night also. He only stops walking when I bring him a new package of medicine, and then only for a short time. Tell me, sir, do you think they sound like the doctor's footsteps?"
Utterson listened closely to the footsteps. They were light on the floor, strangely slow and soft. They were very different from the heavy sound of Jekyll's boots. Utterson shook his head and said,
"No, they do not. A few nights ago,"
said Poole,
"I heard it crying." "Crying?"
said Utterson with a sudden deep feeling of horror.
"It's true, sir. It sounded like the crying of a child who is lost. It was so terrible that it made me want to cry, too."
By this time, 10 minutes had passed, and Utterson lifted his heavy tool. Poole put the candle down on a table, and he and Utterson slowly climbed up the stairs. They could still hear the sound of someone walking in the office, but as they came to the top of the stair, the sound stopped immediately.
"Jekyll,"
yelled Utterson in his loudest voice,
"I demand to see you."
The room was silent.
"I warn you,"
cried the lawyer.
"we know that something strange is going on in that room. I will see you, even if I have to break down the door to do so." "No, Utterson,"
cried a voice from behind the room.
"Please don't enter. Have mercy." "That's not Jekyll's voice,"
cried the lawyer.
"It's Hyde's. Poole, take down that door."
He stepped back so Poole would have space to swing the axe. The first strike of the axe made the whole room shake, but only a small cut in the wood beside the lock was made. A scream came like that of an animal in a cage from inside the office. Poole lifted the axe again. He brought it down and a small piece of wood broke off. But the door, like everything in Henry Jekyll's house, was well built and strong. So Poole had to strike the door 5 times before the lock broke off and the broken door fell down. The door made a loud crash when it hit the floor, and then the room became silent. Mr. Utterson did not enter, but looked around at the scene in front of him. There was a large fire going and a pot of water boiling. On a table, papers sat in a neat pile. Another table was covered with a few bottles of chemicals and medicines. Mr. Utterson walked slowly into this quiet, comfortable room and looked around carefully. There was a large chair in one corner, and Utterson could see 2 feet behind it. He walked over and found a man lying, with his face down on the floor. Utterson reached a hand down and turned the man over. Poole, standing right behind the lawyer, took a deep breath of surprise.
"I was right,"
he cried.
"It's Mr. Hyde." "Yes,"
said Mr. Utterson.
"And he is dead."
Chapter 15. Where is Jekyll? Hyde's body lay on the floor wearing clothes that were too large for him. Poole noticed that he was wearing one of Dr. Jekyll's favorite jackets. Lying next to him on the floor was a broken glass, and the 2 men could smell a bitter scent in the air.
"That is the smell of poison,"
Mr. Utterson told Poole.
"He killed himself. We have arrived too late to either save him or punish him. The only thing we can do now is to find Jekyll's body. I fear that if he was murdered a week ago, as you believe, then his body may already be a very horrible sight."
Poole called the servants together and explained their task. They searched the office closely, all of its closets and corners. Not being able to find his body, they moved on to the laboratory. There the closets were all empty and filled with dust. It was clear that no one had used them in a long time. The group was very confused about where to search next. There were not many rooms in the house that Hyde could have hidden a large body without being discovered.
"Perhaps Hyde buried him under the floor,"
suggested Poole, without much hope in his voice.
"Or maybe Hyde took him outside one night and buried him elsewhere."
The 2 men went to examine the back door, but found that it was locked on the inside and outside, and the key thrown in a corner, broken into 2 pieces. They returned to the office without any ideas. Mr. Utterson began to carefully search the room, not for Jekyll's body, but for a clue. He saw a book lying open on a small table by the fire. It was a book about religion that Jekyll often carried around with him. Utterson looked inside and saw horrible things, wild criticisms and dirty words, written in Jekyll's handwriting all over its pages. He closed the book hard and turned away, upset at the strange thing he had seen. He saw Poole staring into the large mirror.
"I just had an interesting thought, Mr. Utterson,"
said Poole.
"If this mirror could speak, it would tell us everything that we want to know."
Utterson nodded in agreement.
"Certainly, that mirror has seen some strange and horrible sights here. But the strangest thing is that Jekyll decided to put a mirror in this room full of science. I can't understand why Jekyll would need it."
Poole had no answer. Utterson then began looking through the neat piles of papers on one table and found an envelope addressed to him lying on top of the largest pile. When he opened it, 3 pieces of paper fell out. The first paper was a new will by Jekyll. It was written in almost exactly the same way as the first will, locked away in the lawyer's safe. There was one shocking difference, though. Where Hyde's name appeared in the first will, in this new will, Utterson's own name had been written instead of Hyde's.
"I don't understand. What can this mean?"
exclaimed the lawyer.
"Jekyll removed Hyde's name from his will, and now says that I am to receive all his possessions. Yet Hyde, who has been here for at least a week, did not destroy the will. Surely Hyde had no reason to like me."
The next paper caused Utterson to cry in joy, because the date at the top said that it was written that same morning.
"Quick, Poole,"
cried the lawyer.
"come, look at this." Dr. Jekyll was alive and in this room today. Hyde could not have killed him. He must still be alive and hiding somewhere.
Poole was first excited by the news, but his joy quickly turned to confusion.
But why should he hide, Mr. Utterson? I am not sure, Poole, but if I am correct in believing that Hyde killed himself, then we must act very carefully and make sure that nothing terrible happens to the doctor. Listen to what he writes in this letter.
Utterson read aloud.
My dear Utterson, when you find this letter, I will have disappeared. How or why I have left, I cannot tell you. I fear that the end is near for me. Our friend Lanyon told me he was going to give you a letter to read after my disappearance. Read it now to understand what has happened to me. If you still wish to know more, read the confession I have put inside this envelope with this letter. Goodbye, dear Utterson. Your unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll.
The two men stood silent, looking down at the table where Jekyll's confession was, still in its envelope. Finally, the lawyer grasped the letter and put it in his pocket.
I am going home, Poole, where I can read this letter alone,
said Utterson.
I will first read Dr. Lanyon's letter, which is in my safe. Whether Dr. Jekyll is dead or alive, hiding somewhere, we can at least try to save his good name.
The lawyer then looked at his watch.
It is 10 o'clock now. I will return before midnight, and we will call for the police when I return.
Poole nodded and said goodbye to Utterson. The butler stayed in the room for a moment afterwards. He removed the boiling pot of water from the fire and said goodbye to his old master in his mind. He locked the office and the laboratory doors as he left. Inside, the fire continued to burn a deep red, keeping the dead man warm. Chapter 16. Lanyon's Letter. Mr. Utterson walked home as quickly as he could and went directly to his safe. He took out the letter Dr. Lanyon sent him before his death. He took off his coat, sat in his large library chair, and looked at the first page. The handwriting was strong and neat, like Dr. Lanyon's usually was. Utterson could see that he had written the letter with a shaking hand. Utterson read these words.
Dear Utterson, 4 days ago I received a letter from Henry Jekyll. The events in the 4 days since I received the letter have quickly aged me many years and weakened me so much that I fear I will not live much longer. I hardly even have the strength to write this letter to you now. I promise that everything I am about to tell you in this letter is completely true. I was surprised to receive a letter from Jekyll because I had just seen him the night before at a dinner party. He had sent the envelope by a special messenger to guard against its loss. I knew it must be important. The letter was highly emotional and most strange for Dr. Jekyll. Jekyll wrote to me, Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest and best friends. I know we have often had disagreements about scientific questions, but I would always have helped you if you needed me, as I am about to ask you. Lanyon, my life, my soul, and my honor all depend on you. If you fail me tonight, I will certainly be lost. As soon as you finish reading this letter, go directly to my house by carriage. I have left instructions for Poole, my butler, and he will be expecting you. A carpenter and a locksmith will also be waiting at the house for you. You should immediately break down the door of my office. You will then enter alone,
On the right side of the room there is a cabinet. Take out the top drawer. I am so full of worry right now that I cannot remember if I locked the drawer or not. If it is locked, break it open. In the drawer you will find some powders and liquids and a notebook. Bring the whole drawer and everything back to your house exactly as it is. That is the first part of your task, and the easiest part as well. If you begin this task as soon as you receive this letter, you will be home with the drawer before midnight. Please be certain to return before midnight with the drawer in your hands. Do not delay. I have arranged for another messenger to be at your house at exactly midnight. I am sending him then because your servants will be asleep at this time. I ask that you yourself meet the messenger at the door and that you receive him alone. Give him the drawer and all the things inside. If you do all of this for me, you will earn my greatest thanks. 5 minutes after you deliver the drawer, if you wish to have an explanation for these strange affairs, you shall have one. You will see that these strange arrangements were completely necessary. If you miss any part of these instructions, you will cause my death or the loss of my mind. Pray for me in this hour. I am in a strange place, fighting a fear so black that no words can describe it. Now, you have the power to save me from these troubles and make them disappear as if they had never existed, simply by doing as I ask. Help me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend, Henry Jekyll. P.S. As I closed this envelope, a new fear entered my soul. It is possible that the messenger may fail me, and then you will not receive this letter tonight. If this happens, then please do this task tomorrow. I will send another messenger at midnight. Perhaps, however, it may already be too late by then. If no messenger comes, you will know that you will never again see Henry Jekyll.
Lanyon's letter continued.
I read Jekyll's terrible letter several times. I worried that Jekyll had lost his mind, but I could not know for sure, and decided to do as he requested. I went directly to Jekyll's house. There, as he said, Poole was waiting with the 2 workmen. We went together to Jekyll's office at the back of his laboratory. The carpenter knew that it would be hard to get through the thick door and shook his head. Luckily, the locksmith was an expert and said he could open the lock. It was a difficult lock, and it took him almost 2 hours to open the door. I entered alone, went to the cabinet, found that the drawer was not locked, took it out, and carried it into the laboratory. The butler packed some straw over it and tied a cloth around it. I then got into a carriage and brought it home. While waiting for midnight, I examined the contents of the drawer carefully. The powders were all wrapped up neatly, but not the way that a professional chemist would do. I could see that Jekyll himself had mixed and wrapped them. I opened one and smelled it. It seemed to be a common white salt. The liquid was more interesting. It was blood red and had a strong smell. I could not guess all the chemicals inside it. I have studied many chemicals in my life as a doctor, and this one did not smell like any I have smelled before. There was nothing interesting in the notebook. Many dates were written inside it, but no words. It must have been a record of one of Jekyll's experiments. It seemed, like most of Jekyll's other experiments, not to have any real use for science. I tried to imagine how these few items in the drawer could have affected Jekyll's life so greatly.
I could not understand why his messenger should come to see me and not go straight to see Poole, or one of Jekyll's other servants. I was also worried about having to meet this messenger alone and in secret. Still, I trusted Jekyll and sent my servants to bed. I prepared my old handgun in case I had to defend myself. My clock rang 12 times, and a moment later I heard a light knock on the front door. I opened the door and found a small and strange-looking man standing there. "Are you Dr. Jekyll's messenger?" I asked. He nodded, and I asked him to come in. He turned his head around and looked out into the night. There was a policeman walking outside in the street, not far off, and this seemed to worry my visitor. He entered quickly. I reached into my pocket, grasped the gun inside, and led him into my office. I had never met the man before. He was short and looked ill, and for some reason I hated him as soon as I saw him. The clothes he was wearing were much too large for him. He had tied up his trouser legs to keep them off the ground. His jacket was so large that it covered his body and hung down to his knees. He was so excited that he seemed to be on fire. "Have you got the drawer? Have you got it?" he cried. He even pulled at one of my arms as if to hurry an answer from me. When he touched me, I felt a cold feeling run through my blood, and I took a quick step back. "You forget, sir, we have not been introduced yet. Please sit down," I said. I sat down myself and pointed my hand to a chair across from mine. I tried to act like a doctor toward a patient, but it was difficult not to feel a terrible fear in my heart as I looked at this man. He sat and spoke to me with good manners. "I am sorry, Dr. Lanyon. I have been in a hurry and forgot my politeness. I am here at the request of your friend and colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll. I was told that... Suddenly he paused and put a hand to his throat. He started to have trouble breathing and speaking, and I could see that though he was speaking calmly, he was fighting against some great wildness inside himself. I understood. A drawer. I suddenly felt a great pity for him and pointed to the drawer. It was on a table and covered by a sheet. "It is over there, sir." He jumped at it, then stopped and tried to control himself. He put his hand to his heart. A terrible expression of pain came onto his face. I worried that he was about to fall down with illness and said softly, "Try to calm yourself." He turned to me with an ugly smile. Then, closing his eyes and with an expression of fear on his face, he suddenly pulled away the sheet. When he opened his eyes again and looked down at the drawer, he let out a cry of great relief. It was a moment before he became quiet again and controlled himself. Then he asked me in a fairly normal voice, "Do you have a measuring glass?" I got him the glass. He thanked me and began to work immediately. He first poured a bit of the blood-red liquid into the glass and added some of the many powders. The mixture began to smoke. It changed from red to deep purple. The smoking stopped, and then the liquid changed to a bright green. He nodded and set the glass down on the table. Turning to me, he said, "Now, Dr. Lanyon, you must make a decision. Should I take this glass and leave? If I do, you will not know more than before. But you will still have the deep thanks to Dr. Jekyll forever. Or, if you wish me to stay here and continue my task, you will learn about a shocking new era of scientific knowledge. The possibilities of fame and power will be yours in this room tonight. What you will see will shock and amaze you. It's up to you to decide what you want." I was shaking from the things this strange man had said, and tried to keep my voice calm. "I have come too far to stop now," I replied. "Very well," he said. "But, Dr. Lanyon, you must remember your professional promise. You must not tell anyone what you see here tonight." He then picked up the glass. "And now, you who have such narrow medical views, you who have insulted the value of Dr. Jekyll's research, you who have laughed at him, watch." He lifted the glass to his lips and drank it down in one gulp. He then cried out in pain and fell back against the table. He grasped the back of a chair tightly, breathing deeply. His eyes became red and seemed as if they were going to come out of his head. His body seemed to grow. His face appeared to change. I was standing in shock, and walked back against the wall as far from this horror as I could. But then I looked down and screamed aloud. There, in front of my eyes, as white and ill-looking as a man almost dead, there stood Henry Jekyll. What Jekyll told me in the next hour, I will not, no, cannot write. It destroyed my life and my soul. All my ideas and all of my training as a man of science and doctor for the sick, all of it now felt without meaning. I cannot sleep at night any more, and in the day I sit alone full of fear. I know that soon I will die from this shock, yet I still can hardly believe what I have seen. I will tell you only one last thing, Utterson. The strange man who came into my house that night was, as Jekyll told me later, known by the name of Hyde, and the police hunt him in all England as the murderer of Sir Danvers Carew. Signed, Dr. Hasty Lanyon.
Chapter 17. The Twins of Good and Evil. Mr. Utterson was shocked and amazed by Lanyon's letter. He now understood that Henry Jekyll had not poisoned Hyde and disappeared. Yet he also knew that he could not possibly tell this to the police, his family, his servants, or anyone. The world would learn that the murderer, Mr. Hyde, was dead, but they would never learn what had happened to Dr. Jekyll or why he had disappeared. The people of London would never see either man again. But these men would never, even for an hour, leave Mr. Utterson's thoughts. Utterson was afraid to know how all these terrible things had come about, but he realized that he had already learned too much to stop now. Like Lanyon, he had seen things and was now part of the affair. Therefore, with shaking hands, he opened the envelope that Jekyll had left him and began to read the doctor's words.
I, Henry Jekyll, was born in a family with much money and good name. I was very interested in my studies from an early age. If I had a serious fault, it was that I enjoyed having fun and sometimes became careless. Often, I only wanted to have fun. But I hid my carelessness deep inside my heart, because I desired the respect of all men and wanted to become a man of good name. Thus, beginning in my early youth, I began to live two different lives. My youthful fun and hidden actions were actually not especially bad. In fact, many men have also had high spirits and occasionally done small criminal acts. But I was from a good family, and learned to have very high views of myself. I felt ashamed of even the smallest faults in my soul. I hid my faults and bad deeds. I could not let my family and friends know of them. Hiding my actions caused me great unhappiness. Because of this, I spent much time thinking about the souls and desires of man in general. I could not become someone I was not. When I worked day after day to do charitable action and to cure the pain of my patients, I was Henry Jekyll. When I did wrong or horrible things, I was also Mr. Jekyll. My studies in science have led me to this truth. A man is not just one person, but actually two. And these two men inside of us each have a voice, and each wishes to take control. But I have only discovered part of the secret. Perhaps scientists in the future will discover that a man is not only two men, but many men. Long before I began my scientific experiments to prove the two-ness of men, I dreamed about it. I wished deeply to separate these two men of good and evil inside me and give each man a body to control. Then I would no longer feel the unhappiness of fighting the evil man inside me. If I could separate the two men inside me, the good twin could walk with a true heart, doing good deeds, and no longer have to fight with the terrible feelings caused by his evil side. The evil twin would become free as well. He could do what he wanted without being challenged by his good self. The fight between the two sides of man could then end. A man would be free to be both people inside him. When I began my experiments in my laboratory, I discovered that some mixtures of drugs had the effect of changing a man's skin and body. These drugs could change the very size of a man. I will not write down which drug and medicines I used for two reasons. The first reason is that I never completed my experiments, as this letter will later explain. I was not able to completely divide the good and evil inside me. My second reason is that I now understand that we cannot throw away the problems in our lives and make them disappear. A man cannot always be happy. When we try, even more unhappiness returns to trouble us. For many months, I could not decide if I should test my laboratory experiments on myself. I knew well that I risked death, but in the end, since the liquid that would change me was ready, I could not resist. I had dreamed of this possibility for so long and worked so hard, I had to see if my experiment was a success. I bought the last ingredient, a large quantity of a certain white salt. Late one night, I mixed these ingredients. They smoked and changed into many wild colors. I held that first glass in my hand for a long time, staring at it and imagining what might happen to me if I drank it. I knew it might mean death to drink it. But then a strange courage filled me, and I quickly drank it down. Horrible pains ran through my body. I felt ill, and then strange. I feared that my death would soon come. But then these feelings disappeared, and I then felt better, as if I had just recovered from a long illness, but with a difference. I felt younger, happier, and even lighter in weight. A new, sweet feeling filled me. I felt free to do anything I wanted, even the most terrible things. I could let all the desires that I had hidden inside my heart come out. The feeling was like a strong wine, and I lifted my arms to the sky in welcome. When I moved my arms, I realized that my jacket was now covering my hands. I had become smaller. At that time, I did not have a mirror in my office, though I later bought one. I could not let my servants see me, so I walked through the house as quietly as a thief. Once I was safe in my own room, I looked in the mirror and saw Edward Hyde for the first time. Let me now give you my ideas as a scientist on why Hyde was younger and smaller than Jekyll. Hyde, and all my evil desires, had been hidden inside me for most of my life. Because of this, his body had experienced less activity for most of the twins' life. Jekyll had worked hard, and his body had suffered and become old. Now Jekyll was a tired old man, whereas Hyde was still young, ready to begin his life of evil. I stared in the mirror for many minutes, studying my new body. I could see that there was a deep evil in Hyde's face, but he did not disgust me. I welcomed him. Hyde, too, was myself. Hyde was natural and human like all of us. In many ways, I thought he was better than human, because he was not a divided person. He had a single soul. I quickly realized that everyone who met Hyde immediately felt dislike for him. There is a reason for this. All human beings are both good and evil, but Hyde alone was pure evil, and people could feel this in their hearts. I did not dare to stay long at the mirror. I hurried back to my office, prepared the mixture again, and drank it. I felt the same pain, and then Henry Jekyll returned. That was the beginning of my life with Hyde. Perhaps if I had a different aim in my experiments, things would have gone differently. I did not realize that Jekyll would continue to be a mix of good and evil, while Hyde was all evil. I had aimed to make Jekyll a man of pure good, but he still had all the faults and problems that he did before. As Jekyll, I began to need Hyde more and more, and my life became worse and worse. From that time on, I often changed between Jekyll and Hyde. When I became bored with medicine and science and my old and ordinary friends, I could instantly have the freedom of youth as Hyde. I became Hyde's servant in a way, but I loved it. I rented a room for Hyde and bought him clothing. I described him to my servants and told them that he was to be obeyed and that he could use the house whenever I was gone. I even gave Hyde a good future by leaving him all my money in a will that surprised you so much, Utterson. So I became happy because I could live without the freedom of doubt. Hyde could do evil things without feeling bad afterwards. Whatever terrible crime Hyde did, he could always be safe a moment later. He would turn into Henry Jekyll, a man with a good name, who no one would suspect. So evil, drunken, and horrible in every way, I ran wild over London as Edward Hyde. Of course, Hyde could not always escape from his bad deeds. This first happened the night that he knocked down a small girl. He was surrounded by her family and many other people, and he feared for his safety. Finally, he paid them enough money to make them leave him. Unfortunately, he had to use a check with Jekyll's signature. The next day I opened a checking account for Hyde by changing my handwriting. Thus, he would always have money when he needed it. About 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, I had come home from a night out as Hyde. Usually, I returned to Hyde's home and went to sleep as Hyde. But this night, Jekyll had an early morning appointment with a patient the next day. So I changed back to Jekyll and slept at the doctor's house. In the morning, I woke very early and could not remember for a moment where I was. I almost expected to see the furnishings of Hyde's room. When I got out of bed, I saw that my hand was lean and covered with dark hair. It looked almost like a monkey's hand, but Jekyll's hand was large, clean, and white. A terrible feeling passed through me. I jumped out of bed and ran to the mirror. My fear was true. I had gone to sleep as Henry Jekyll, and without drinking the special liquid, I had awakened as Edward Hyde. I could not understand how this could have happened, but I had no time to think about it. My patient would come soon, and I needed to become Jekyll again quickly. By this time, all my servants were awake and working, and the medicines and drugs I needed were in my office on the other side of the house. I could cover my face, but the servants would still see how short I was. Then I realized that if any of the servants did see me, they would only be surprised at seeing Hyde in a part of the house he did not usually go into. So I dressed in Hyde's clothes and walked quickly to the laboratory with a thin smile on my lips, for as Hyde, I was braver than Jekyll had ever been.
Chapter 18. The Man Who Died Twice. With each sentence, Utterson became more shocked and horrified. After reading about Jekyll's midnight change, he had to put down the letter and think about Henry Jekyll's words for a while. But the desire to learn more was too strong to fight, so Utterson began to read again.
Waking up as Edward Hyde was the beginning of the end for me. I ran from the bedroom to the laboratory. I drank the mixture, and within a few minutes I was Henry Jekyll again. I sat down to breakfast and tried not to let the servants see my heart's fear. I now understood that Edward Hyde was becoming stronger every time I drank the mixture. I was afraid that the balance between my good and evil sides might change, and that the evil one would become more powerful. If that happened, I might become Edward Hyde forever. The drug had not always worked perfectly. In the beginning, I sometimes had to drink 2 glasses of the mixture to become Hyde. Once I drank 3 and still could not change into him. Now the difficulty was the opposite. Each time I needed to drink more and more of the mixture to become Jekyll. I realized I would soon have to choose between the twins. If I became Hyde forever, I would be hated by all. But if I became Jekyll forever, then I would have to give up all evil pleasures, and he would be unhappy without them. Finally, I chose to be the doctor, and for 2 months I was a kind and good man. Then it happened. Hyde had been a prisoner inside me for so long that when he came out, he was full of youth and power. It was the night that Hyde murdered Sir Danvers. As I hit him, I felt the greatest excitement of my life run through my body. I enjoyed it so much that I could not stop until my cane broke. Then I suddenly realized that my actions had put my own life in danger. I ran to Hyde's rooms, burned my papers, and left forever. But all during that time, I was happy with my violence. I let myself into Jekyll's laboratory and drank the mixture with a song on my lips. Once I was Jekyll again, I fell down on my knees, filled with regret, and prayed loudly to God. I cried and wished that I had never become Hyde, my horrible twin. Now that the police were looking for him, he could never again come to Jekyll's house. I locked the door and broke the key. I admit that Jekyll often missed Hyde, but for a while I kept him trapped inside me. It was too scary to think that the police were looking for him all over London. But one day, as I was sitting in the park and trying to calm my thoughts, I felt a great desire to become Hyde again run through my body. I began to shake, and for a moment I felt very weak. This passed, and I suddenly felt strong and brave. When I looked down, I saw my clothes had become too large for me, and Hyde's hand was grasping my hat. I could no longer think clearly. Then Hyde, always smart and ready to take a risk, took control of my mind. I had to get home to my drugs, but I had locked the back door and destroyed the key. If I went in through the front door, my servants would recognize Hyde and go get the police. I needed help and decided to use Lanyon. Though the police were searching for me, I bravely took a carriage to a small hotel. I rented a room there and wrote letters using Jekyll's handwriting. I sent one letter to Poole and the other to Lanyon. I sent both by special messenger. At about 11 o'clock, I went out to see Lanyon. I hid outside his house until exactly midnight. I then walked up to his door very quickly because I feared I would be seen. I found that Lanyon had not failed me. He had brought the drugs I needed, but his horror of me and what I had done added to my feelings of guilt and fear. Once I was changed back into Jekyll and again safe in my own house, I gave thanks. But the very next day, as I was walking across the courtyard after breakfast, I again began to shake like I had in the park before. I knew I was changing into Hyde. I had just enough time to run to my office, and then Hyde stood there, looking into my mirror where Jekyll had been. I needed to take 2 glasses of the drug to bring Jekyll back. But only 6 hours later, I felt the shake again. From that day on, I needed to drink the mixture every few hours to remain Jekyll. If I slept at night or rested in my chair during the day, Hyde came out. I was constantly filled with fear and hatred of him. Finally, I became hopeless. Jekyll and Hyde were fighting a terrible battle, and Hyde was stronger. Hyde still was able to find time for his evil tricks. He wrote horrible things in a book I loved, and he destroyed a painting of my father. As I write this letter, I am Jekyll, but I know that I will change back soon. I now have no hope of living, for I will soon have used up the rest of the drug I had left. I have sent Poole all over London, trying to buy the same salt I used to make the original mixture. None of the new salt has worked. I think that perhaps the salt I first purchased accidentally had some other chemical mixed in it, and that is what made my mixture work. Soon, Hyde will control my life completely. I have just used the last bit of the original salt. I will finish writing this letter to you and sit for a few last minutes as Dr. Jekyll. Then Jekyll will die, and Mr. Hyde will control my body and mind. I do not know if the police will catch Hyde and kill him for his crimes, or whether he will decide to kill himself before he is caught. I do not care. It is not my problem now. It is now the problem of my new self, Edward Hyde. I am beginning to feel myself shake again. I see the end racing towards me. The time for the death of Henry Jekyll has come. Utterson, my true friend, goodbye, goodbye.